So, Bob, as usual, we have a lot of emails from the patrons that are addressed to both you and me, and I thought we would read those emails and answer them. What do you say, Bob?
I say let's read those emails and then answer them.
Yeah.
Hopefully coherently.
Hopefully coherently. And whenever I introduce you on the podcast, I always want to refer to you as the way we really refer to you, as Bobby G.
Yeah. It's not my professional stage name, but right.
Yeah. I don't think I ever just say, "Hey, Bob." That's not usually
what
we say.
Well, in my phone, you're Kirky Joe.
Yeah. I mean, when you have good friends, you don't call them by their real name. That's just a rule.
Yeah, right.
It's funny, in college, people called me Honda for so long and so pervasively that I had a friend who I thought was pretty close, and one time someone called me Kirk, and she was like, "Why were they calling you Kirk?" And I what do you mean? She's like, "Well, why were they calling you Kirk?" I said, "Well, that's my first name." And she said, "This whole time, I thought you were kind of like Cher, where you just had one name, or it was just Honda."
I heard people call you Honda. I just can't do it.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like referring to people by their last name. It feels disrespectful.
I could see calling you Gettle.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
To me, it reminds me of playing sports, because when you play sports, no one ever called anyone by their first name. It was always your last name. All right. First email. Greta, she writes, "I've always heard that if your therapist cannot resolve your problems within 1 year, then whatever they are doing is not effective and you should move on. Sounds reasonable to me, but in listening to your podcast, you talk about how people are in therapy with you for years and that's normal to you. How would a person ever know if they just have an ineffective therapist and their issues should have been resolved long ago?" End of email. Bob, what do you think? Gettle, give me an answer.
Yeah, shit. The pressure. Coach. Well, I don't know that there is an easy answer to that question, though. I do think that the notion that therapy takes a year is erroneous and full of... There's problems with that. And I've been a therapy client. I've been a client in therapy for 30 years, with my current therapist for 3.5. And I think that's okay. I was just thinking about a client that I'm seeing these days the other day, and just thinking about something that I heard you say, I don't know, maybe 1.5 years ago, where you're like, well, therapy takes a long time. Therapy does take a long time. You're talking about, well, the way I think about it is we're talking about people's attachment wounds. So we're talking about their really deep core view of the world. And I don't know that we have a treatment that, I don't know of any evidence-based treatment that, a year is good. Maybe there's one out there, but I'm not aware of one. So the second part of the question had to do with, how do you know if your therapist, how do you know it's not a bad therapist? I think I'd look at other clues. How do I feel when I'm with this person? Do I feel like I can be candid and open? How do they perceive me? Do they have care, curiosity, and interest in me? Or are they judging? What's the quality of our interaction? Do I feel connected to the person? If I have disappointments, do I feel free to voice them? And depending on how my therapist would respond to, like, say, a disappointment, that might be a clue that they're not a good therapist. If therapists get defensive, which, everybody does, but if they get defensive and then there's no move back towards repair, then maybe that would be a sign that they're not a good therapist. But I don't think that you can just hang your hat on, well, I've been in therapy for 1 year and I'm not better yet, so must be a bad therapist. I think that by itself is not a good data point.
Right. I totally agree. Just to reiterate some of the things you're saying, this notion of resolving problems within a year is a silly parameter. It's basically coming from a place of a lack of understanding of what therapy is. And it denies it. The lack of understanding is so huge because, one, as you're saying, there's a ton of evidence that long-term therapy is necessary for things like attachment issues and personality disorders and really just a variety of things. I mean, even like good CBT therapists will say that you should break away from the manualized 10-week program to actually address the issues. And it also is a lack of understanding of why people come to therapy. If someone comes to therapy and they say, so I have a simple trauma problem where I was in a car accident and I'm having mild symptoms. Well, yeah, if it takes 15 years to treat that, then, and that's the only thing you ever worked on, then yeah, we would say there's something wrong there. But the typical reasons why people come into therapy are such that it takes 30 years to get halfway down the road. There are styles of therapy where you're talking about what is good in life and who am I as a human being. These are not things that you can, 51 weeks of therapy and I'm done. It also plays into notions that we've talked about before that are propagated in our society that are stigmatizing to both therapy and to clients and to people who need help. It's this notion of like, look, pal, if you can't get your shit together within a year, what's wrong with you? Or look, therapist, if you've been stringing this client along for a year, you're just trying to milk them for money. Or look, kid, if you think that being in therapy for that long, you're addicted to therapy and dependency is bad. Just these ridiculous notions that I'm just getting so tired of. So this notion that like you're supposed to finish therapy in under a year, it just plays into all that stuff. Now, you could also just have a total misunderstanding of what therapy is and not have a stigma around it. Maybe that's where it's coming from. But yeah, this other question of, how would a person ever know if they just have an ineffective therapist and their issues should have been resolved long ago? Bob brought up some excellent questions that I'll just basically reword. The questions to ask yourself are, is it helping? Like, for example, people will often say, well, honestly, I feel better than I did last year, or I feel more understood now. My relationships are better, obviously lower symptoms. I feel like it's worth my time. Now, therapy can make you feel worse because that's just sometimes the growth process. But sometimes it could be an indication that therapy actually isn't working. And a common example that I often yell at my supervisees about is that if you are not aware of how to treat trauma, you can re-trigger people by just talking, just headlong, moving into trauma narratives without doing the prerequisite steps. And so sometimes therapy can be very harmful and can feel very bad, very dysregulating, dissociative, distressful. You can even become suicidal as a result of a therapist not knowing how to treat trauma correctly. But the question that I always pose, and which is just basically what you're saying, Bob, is it helping? And if you can't answer that question, that could mean a number of things. One, it could mean that it's not helping. Two, it could mean that you actually don't know why you're in therapy and you don't know what helping means, you and your therapist. Three, it could mean that therapy is helping, but you are your perspective is such that it's hard for you to see how it's helping. And that's a dicey sort of thing because it's like, well, yes, it's like a thing a cult leader would say to you of like, it's not working because you're just looking at it wrong. So of course that's a complicated thing. But the other question to ask yourself is it worth the effort to you? Because it is effort. It's money, it's time, it's annoying in some ways. And so is it worth it? Is it worth that effort? Another question to ask, which is what Bob was saying, is does your therapist have a good understanding of your goals and what you want to change in your life and how you're going to get there? This is what we call the Therapeutic Alliance, which is comprised of three components, which is, do you agree on the goals? Do you agree on the task to get to that goal? And do you have a good bond? Do you have a good attachment? And can your therapist explain the therapeutic path that you're on? I frequently just compulsively will say the path that I see the client on, not only as a way to contextualize, but also as a way to inspire them and make them feel like, look how far you've come. I just did this in a session the other day. The clients seemed to be demoralized a little bit, and I felt compelled to point out that a few years ago, they wouldn't have been able to do what they had done. And although they still see issues that they want to, grow and change, they've come so far in that time. And so if your therapist can't explain, like, this is where you've been, this is where you are, this is where we're going, or at least the therapist could at least throw it out there as a suggestion, like, well, here's my perspective. I'd like to hear your perspective, client. If your therapist can't do that at all, then there's a problem there. And this is one of those things that I try to drill into my supervisees, which is that you've probably never taken a class on how to answer that question. You've probably never read an article, you've never read research. It's just one of those therapist functions that are critical to know that I just developed on my own over time, trial and error. And so you can't depend on graduate school or supervision to teach you that. You have to have a good supervisor that knows the gaps in your education or in your path. And so what I do is I'll just do exercises. It's like, okay, think of a client. Okay, that client just asked you, what are we doing? Okay, write down what you would say. And almost all the time, I just get blank stares. These students are like, now they're not stupid, but they just haven't been taught. And this is one of those things that is a skill that you just have to learn trial by fire, or have a good instructor or something. Anyway, so questions to ask yourself: is it helping? Is it worth the effort? And does your therapist have a good understanding of your goals and what you want to change and how you're going to get there? And in closing, what I'll say to Greta is, in my opinion, most people should be in therapy at least half of their life, because it just helps. The older I get, or I don't know, the more I think about it, I can't think of a single person that I have ever met in my entire life that didn't need at least 20 years of therapy. Like, I just don't know anyone. And I'm not talking like icing on the cake. I'm talking about fundamental issues of past traumas, that relational traumas or otherwise, that affect us. So I just can't think of a single human being. I mean, what we categorize as like secure attachment, even then, it has this implication of just like, well, you're good. But I've never met a totally securely attached. I've never met anyone that I would characterize as like completely securely attached, or of secure attachment style completely. So it's just that mostly or something, or in most situations, but that still leaves, say, 40% of situations where you're struggling, you're suffering from issues being triggered in you. But anyway, so I hope that answers your question, Greta.
It's interesting what you're saying. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I think when you say that, though, you're just on the heels of positive psychology, right? Which is about how to make life better. Therapies come from the world of, you got a problem, got to do something to fix it. And psychology hasn't really paid as much attention to, how do we help people enhance the quality of their lives? How do we help them have more secure connection with people, or more joy or satisfaction? So just the idea that a person might need 20 years of therapy doesn't mean that a person has pathology. It means that this might be part of what it takes to be optimal. I'm thinking about that Maslow triangle, where self-actualization is at the top of the thing. It's like making a life that's meaningful and purposeful and fulfilling and satisfying. Therapy can help with that, but it doesn't mean that I'm a basket case. I'm a fucking mess.
Yeah, or we're all basket cases.
Or we all are.
There's just nothing odd about the fact that we all have issues. We all overreact. We all are hurt and will have defense mechanisms that will shoot ourselves in the foot. We all lose perspective. We all need extra help with validation and being heard and understood. We all need that extra space to just vent about, speaking about venting, I don't know if my wife would be entirely happy with me talking about this, but it's not bad. But this morning she was out on a walk with the dog, and she comes in to from this, she comes in the door, and she's possibly the angriest I've ever seen her in my life, and she was screaming about this jogger who was, okay, if you're listening to this in the future, we're smack dab in the middle of COVID right now, and cases are, just as strongly being spread throughout society. And me and my family are extremely cautious about what we're doing. We're really trying not to catch this thing and spread it, and there are all these complications. It's not just getting the flu. There's you could have brain damage and lung damage, and obviously people die. So we're pretty buttoned up about that. And when she was on her walk, she comes in and she says, this woman was running toward me on the street, and she did a farmer blow and then spit, and all the spray went like in my direction. And why would you do that? So we live in a neighborhood where there aren't that many people. It's not a huge, it's pretty suburban. And particularly when you go walking at 7:30 in the morning, there's hardly anyone out. So this other jogger, if she wanted a farmer blow and spit, which I get, honestly, I wish people would just bring a handkerchief with them, honestly, but whatever. You could have waited a little bit of time, gotten sufficiently away from someone. Why would you be basically within, farmer blow spray range of another human being, and one farmer blow and then spit? And because it's just so stupid. I mean, how dumb do you have to be? So, because what if she gets it because of that stupid thing? It's essentially like someone just walking up to you on the subway and just spitting in your face. Like, think about it for a second, person. And she was very upset. And so, I don't know, when I said the word venting, like we all need a therapist to vent to, it just reminded me of...
Well, she's got you.
Of a few minutes ago, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was right there with her on that.
Yeah.
I hope that we don't get COVID because of that person. That would be pretty awful.
I agree with you. I'd be furious.
Patron Steven from Russia has a similar question. He writes, Thanks to your podcast, I've started seeking therapy to help me with anxiety and found a therapist that I like. I've been seeing him for 2 months. I enjoy talking with him, but I always feel like we are not going anywhere. He doesn't give me any practical advice. We are just analyzing different situations without any general course. I like conversations, but I feel more and more like he is not the right person to help me. Maybe it's okay to have those thoughts that early into therapy. Should I stick with him and hope it will work out? End of email. What do you think, Bob?
Oh, this is what you want to talk about.
Yeah.
Like I think what's most interesting about this whole thing is, I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but I watched this program in 60 Minutes once where they did a segment on this culture in China, I think it was China, where two people who are engaged in a business transaction will sit next to each other with a blanket over their laps and carrying on, a relatively superficial conversation about, the weather or whatever. They will, using their hands underneath the blanket, they will conduct their transaction, but it's private. Nobody can see it. And these hand gestures are, it's like a language that, it's understood. So when I do this, I don't know what the gestures look like. I don't know what that means. But in any case, this is how people transact a bartering, an arrangement, like a trade, right? So the reason I think that the reason that comes to mind is because in therapy, oftentimes this is what's happening is we're analyzing this thing. We're talking about this situation, with my sweetheart or whatever, right? And in that, there is something that's happening beneath the surface between two people. And the great thing about therapy is it's a relationship that's set up for self-reflection. In other words, we get to talk about what is it like to sit together. We get to talk about what is the experience of this. And one of the things that Stephen is noticing is that a bunch of questions arise. And if I'm hearing right, and I may be making some assumptions here, but let's presume I'm not. If I'm hearing right, he's saying, these things go off in me and they stay inside me. I find myself not talking about them. The thing I love most about my therapist is his relentless refocusing on our relationship. And I'm a person who's been doing this a long time as both a client and a therapist, and have many times thought, oh yeah, this is a really good session because I'm, complaining about something I'm really upset about. And he is relentlessly bringing our attention back to what is our connection right now? Do you want us to pay attention to you? And whenever he does that, it fills me with shame. But I should restate. The explicitness of that raises the shame that's already in me, that I do not want to look at, that I do not want to experience, and I don't want to feel, but that pushes me around and guides me in all of my relationships in ways that are dissatisfying to me. And so his relentless commitment to focusing on what is our experience together, what is it like to be together, and what do I want, and how does this feel, has been transformative for me in how I work with my clients, because I want to make what's going on underneath the blanket, I want to take the blanket off. Not in an abrupt way, not in a mean-spirited way, but really in a way of making the making that conscious. And I all the time these days, I just think about that scene in The Wizard of Oz where the Dorothy and the gang they're standing in front of the wizard and he's booming. He's like, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. And the man behind the curtain is the wizard. And he's this kind of vulnerable, doddering old guy. He's a good guy, but he has no real power, right? And he's hiding behind a curtain and he's pulling levers. That's how my shame is. It hides behind a curtain and it pulls levers and booms and scares me away. And my therapist relentlessly pulls the curtain aside and invites me to step in. I think Stephen has a real opportunity here. And the long guy is here. So this is an interesting wrinkle. So the situation in my house is it's really hot today. The air conditioner fan is too loud because that disturbs the sound of the thing. And the window open means I invite the crows in to caw and poke about because we have some crows that sort of live in our backyard. And so Kirk and I have shut the window and the air conditioner's off. And so the thing is, and now the the guy is here doing the lawn. So what do you want to do?
So even though the window is closed,
it's all closed.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, people can hear a lawnmower. And now is that your dog going?
That's our neighbor's dog that comes over every day who barks whenever anybody comes in the yard. So unfortunately, Barney will be doing that for a little while.
You babysit your neighbor's dog?
Yeah. When she goes to work, he comes over. He's a great little guy, and we like having him. So it's fun to spend a day with him. Unfortunately, though, it coincides with our work together here today, and we have these background noises that are distracting.
I will say that there's something particularly annoying about weed whackers.
Oh.
I have a neighbor that uses a weed whacker a lot, and the only thing I think is just get an effing lawnmower.
Yeah.
I watch him, and I'm like, a lawnmower would do it so much faster. Weed whackers are for areas that your lawnmower can't get to. Why are you using the weed whacker for everything?
I got that neighbor too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she weed whacks her entire yard when she does anything.
Like, is it just that they are afraid of a lawnmower, or they don't? Is it funner to use a weed whacker or something?
It's hours.
Yeah, when I've been forced to weed whack things for longer than 5 minutes, my back hurts.
Yeah.
It just drives me crazy.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just don't understand some people.
Well, the lawn people, they don't call them weed whackers. They call them string trimmers. They're trimmers. They're for trimming.
Right.
Enough for doing the whole damn yard.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. A lawnmower is an excellent weed whacker. Yeah. Yeah. They should name them like what your lawnmower can't get to, or something.
That would be a good name for them. Yeah.
Well, let's take a break. When we get back, let's continue listening to your neighbors. What do you say?
Nice.
All right, we're back from the break. Let's go into another email from patron Matt from Texas. He writes, how do you handle substance abuse? My use lately is pretty mild, but my current therapist insists that we can't do therapy as long as I'm using at all. My life is pretty empty, and I think getting a job and finding more friends would greatly encourage sobriety. But he won't work on these things with me. Every session, he tries to force me to committing to complete abstinence. This seems shoddy and is starting to seriously piss me off because I've told him so many times what I think I need. End of email. What do you think, Bob?
Well, it's good they're talking about it, that he's speaking up and saying that he has this, that his belief is that his use is not an impediment and that there can be progress made on these other areas in life. I think it's really great that he's speaking up to the therapist about his point of view, and it sounds like they have a genuine difference. So, let's see, what do I think? I think there's probably merit in both sides and that they're polarized. The way all humans get, we take a position when somebody takes an opposite position and we get in a tug of war. And so now the tug of war is about should I or should I not be abstinent? And one of the things that I learned in Aikido is just did we talk about Aikido last time? Aikido is so amazing.
You've talked about it on the podcast before.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a martial art with no offensive moves. And the idea is that when the energy comes your way, you just blend with it. You just work with it. You don't meet force with opposite force. So when I pull, I've done this in my skills class. I get a rope and I have somebody hold one end and I hold the other end and I start pulling. And immediately the other person will pull and match me. Now, they won't pull me over, but they'll pull hard enough so that they're not pulled over. And we actually create stasis where we're both pulling. We're both putting effort into pulling, right? And I suspect that something like that may be happening between this person and their therapist. And so one of the things that, the problem with these kinds of tensions is that something important is being left out. I don't know what the something important is, but the resolution isn't necessarily, well, we go your way or we go my way. There's a person who has an opinion. I think that your use is going to interfere with your goals, right? And I don't want to participate in some process that I think is either inefficient or actually harmful to you. Another person has the point of view that this use is not a problem, this is not interfering, and I think we can. So that's, if I heard right, that's kind of a summary of their tension. And when you're in one of these things, it's very difficult to step back far enough to see, oh yeah, there's your point of view and my point of view and something being left out. Usually we polarize and we lock down in our position, and the harder we pull, the harder the other person pulls. And it happens all the time, and it doesn't mean I'm in a bad therapy. Therapists are humans. You're in a human relationship, and in human relationships, these kinds of polarizations, or as they say in DBT land, dialectics, happen. So this is an opportunity to work with that. I don't know that that's... I don't actually believe in getting real solution focused until the problem is actually identified. So I wouldn't say we've got to rush to, okay, I'm going to be absent, or okay, I'm going to fire you and get another therapist. I'd say that an exploration of the meaning of the thing is probably really important. Like, what's it like that this guy, anyways, I don't know.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, Matt. Okay, what's it like, Matt, for you? Oh shit, I lost my train of thought. What's it feel like when your therapist is pulling? What's it like for you? Does it undermine your sense of self-respect to go along? Does it create shame? Obviously, it pisses you off. You're saying that. It would piss anybody off. I think I would be pissed off if I was in one of these impasses. So I'm talking a lot here, but I guess the message I want to give is talk about it. We are at an impasse. You're pulling hard and I'm pulling hard, and we're stuck. And let's work with that.
Yeah, I love that. But I wonder, and of course there's no way to know, if the therapist would be on board with that kind of conversation. Because
Possibly not.
I think that a lot of therapists would say to that question, well, okay, yeah, we do have an impasse because you need to stop using in order for therapy to work. I'm the professional and you're the client, and that's just the way it's going to be.
We only have one point of view here. We have Matt's point of view about his use, and we don't have the therapist's point of view or assessment of the use, the drug use or whatever. And so it would be remiss to say anything with definiteness.
I mean, who knows? So we have no idea what this other therapist is thinking. I mean,
No.
Matt's use could just be like, what? I'm just using meth 5 times a day. What's the big deal?
Yeah. Right.
And we've certainly seen this kind of denial from people who suffer from substance abuse disorders. Doesn't sound like that. Matt didn't even say what he was using, but so before we go on, I just want to chime in. I didn't want to interrupt you, but you talked about the rope thing, and you brought that to the live show.
Oh God, I would do that differently next time. I was horrified with that interaction afterwards. I left just feeling upset.
So patron Alexis might be actually listening right now. So we did a live show. Was it just last year? Maybe
a couple years, yeah.
And it was it would have been the 10-year anniversary. So it would have been 2 years ago, yeah. And I asked you, Bob. I said, you should do something. People want to see you at the live show. And you said, well, I have this thing that I do in my groups with a rope, and it's kind of cool, and I'll get a volunteer from the audience, and it'll be pretty neat. And what happened?
Well, what I did is, instead of pulling on a rope, which is what I would have done if I could do it over again, I asked Alexa to hold up her hands, like hold them up in front of her, and with her permission, I touched her. And so we're hand to hand, right? Both hands pushing. And I started pushing on her. And instead of pushing back, Alexa kept backing up until I pushed her against the wall. This was my horror. It's like, oh my God. And I'm a pretty big guy, and she's, a little bitty thing. And I'm just like, oh my God, am I traumatizing this poor lady? She's being so kind and gentle to help with the thing. And it's also blowing the message I meant to give. And
so you brought, that's right, you brought the rope, but you didn't use it.
I didn't use it. I would use it next time.
You ad-libbed, you used it. So the idea was you were hoping that she would eventually just stop you.
Yeah.
And resist.
Right.
And it would demonstrate some Aikido therapeutic notion. Yeah. But she didn't, because she thought that you were trying to push her back.
Well, I was. I was just anticipating something different. I've done that thing dozens and dozens of times, and only twice has somebody had that kind of response where I push and they allow me to push them around. So, and poor Alexa, she was so gracious.
Alexis,
excuse me. We traded emails afterwards, and I told her I was so horrified with it, and she's like, "Nope, it's okay." So far as I know, it's okay with Alexis.
No. She's a nice person.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought of with your Aikido thing is, maybe because I'm Japanese, it's in my bones. Chris File, my friend. We were, this would have been, during college years, and there goes the lawnmower. God bless him to actually get the lawnmower going. And we were at a party, and we were drinking, beer out of a keg. And so we all had keg cups. And at some point, one of us started to splash the other person with beer. And it was a summer, an evening. And we would do this, me and File, every once in a while. We just get into this mood at 1:30 in the morning. And so he kept getting me really good, like with full glasses of beer and full keg, solo cups with beer, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna really get him, and then I would miss him, And then we started getting into a physical thing on the front lawn. And he, he's tall, but he's pretty thin.
Yeah.
And so we were really going at it, and he came at me. And I, in my head, instinctively just said, I'm going to do an Aikido move.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go with him. And so he was coming, he's lunging at me real hard. And we're on the front lawn of this house. And he lunges at me. And so I grabbed onto his shirt, and he grabbed onto my shirt. And I just fell backwards as fast and hard as I could.
Wow.
And he flew, no joke, through the air onto the road.
Oh, God.
Face first.
Oh, God.
And everyone saw it. And because it felt so weird, because I was thinking I was just going to go with, I don't know, I thought maybe he would just fall on top of me or something.
Yeah. Right.
But I essentially did some sort of weird judo throw, and he just went, he was okay, but I mean, he had a massive scab from his forehead all the way down his nose, because his face just scraped on the asphalt.
Yeah.
And everyone thought I was just like a complete jerk, but honestly, I just thought there was no way that I meant to do that and thought that was going to happen, and he lunged at me.
Yeah. It's just his energy.
And I just remember thinking in the moment, like slow motion, I'm falling backwards.
Right.
And it just felt like I was throwing a paper airplane. It didn't feel like I was throwing like 170 pounds of man. It just felt like I was just pushing a ball down a hill. It just, as an Aikido person, you probably know how that feels.
Well, I was terrible at Aikido, but I've seen it. If you ever get bored, there's you can watch Aikido videos. There's one in particular, a fella called Endo. He is amazing because he looks like he's not doing anything. But the reason it looks that way is because he expends very little energy as he redirects the energy of the people charging him. And B, he's doing it with people who know how to fall down. And because they know how to fall down well, it looks like they're falling down on purpose. But if they don't fall in the way that they are, they actually will get injured. He'll break their arm. Not wanting to break their arm, but they know how to move well enough to know that if he'll dislocate my shoulder unless I go with the energy. So the problem in that situation, I think, isn't that you threw him, it's that he didn't know how to fall. Right.
Well, even if he did, he was going to the asphalt. Like, I threw him between two parked cars. Imagine I'm essentially near the sidewalk, and then there's the parking strip, and then there's the parked cars, and then there's the street. And so I threw him probably 15 feet or something.
Jeez,
it was,
Louise.
People said that he looked like Superman. Like
Superman just... Wow.
Like he was flying through the air, his arms forward like Superman.
Oh, you just hit it just right. You hit the sweet spot, man.
But man, did I feel bad. I mean, immediately, it's like I see the blood all over his face, and we run into the bathroom, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And
how was he?
He was fine, He had a massive, funny scar down the middle of his face for a few weeks, but which we made endless fun of after a while.
Indeed.
But yeah, so getting to patron Matt's question here about substance abuse and being in therapy, there is a huge debate in our field, actually, and specifically within the field of substance abuse treatment. There are people who say that you can't. So there's a lot of different camps, and I'll just describe all the different camps that I've heard. So there are people who work in substance abuse treatment that will say that therapists are actually bad actors by allowing non-sober clients to be in therapy without holding the line and saying, you got to go to drug treatment with a chemical dependency professional, get sober, and then you can come into therapy with me. Not every substance abuse treatment professional is like this, but I've definitely heard this many, many times, believe me. Because I actually, for a while, worked at a chemical dependency treatment center for a long time. And they would say that, and they would also say that therapists were they were naive about substance abuse. They would go along with clients' pathologies. They would enable using clients to continue to use. This notion of like, oh sure, if you're using and you're sick, they would use these terms. You're using, you're sick with the substance abuse addiction. And you go into a therapist, and the therapist just lets you talk about your problems without confronting you on the fact that you have a substance abuse problem. This is akin to an enabling spouse. And you as a therapist are doing something completely unethical. So that's definitely something that I've heard and is, I would say, a pretty dominant dogma within substance abuse treatment in my anecdotal experience. Then you'll see some people in substance abuse treatment that will be in what they call the harm reduction camp, and they're more flexible. They will say, well, yeah, if, say, you used cocaine every day and it was ruining your life, and then you cut back to using it once every 2 weeks while you were having fun with your friends at a party, then, is it a problem? Well, it's probably not the best thing you could do with your life, but overall, it sounds like you're doing okay. Now, the harm reduction people are not naive either, because they work in substance abuse treatment, and they also know that there is such a thing as a progressive addiction, in that if you have a problem, it tends to get worse over time. And although you're just using cocaine once a month right now, if you have a problem with cocaine, as you have demonstrated in the past, in all likelihood, this is going to progress into a bigger problem, just like it has before. And the fact that you have notions of denial and stubbornness around your use just proves that you're just not ready to be sober yet. And so it's not like harm reduction people are saying things like, well, if you use only once a month, that's fine. But harm reduction people will allow for nuance and for case-by-case basis sort of thing. Whereas the hardliner substance abuse people will say, if you have a problem with substances, you have to be sober, you have to be abstinent. There's just no other way around it. And for a lot of people, that is true. For a lot of people, that is the only way that they're going to get any better, is to be completely sober, because, and I've certainly treated a lot of clients like this before too, is they have such a problem, either genetically or behaviorally or something, with substances that they will, if there's any amount of substance in their life, it will just fester and grow. If there's a tiny little light in the door being ajar, eventually the door is going to be wide open, and it's just going to be a problem. And sobriety and abstinence is the only answer. Okay. So that's in the chemical dependency world. And in the therapy world, you'll see also, I've seen various different perspectives. I've seen therapists who, and this is more something that I would have seen a long time ago, but I still see a fair amount of this, actually. I would estimate anecdotally that a good half of therapists believe the following, which is that if a client has a problem with substance use, they cannot be in therapy. They've got to get clean, and because there's nothing that you can accomplish at all in therapy if that client is using. But then you have to ask yourself in that group, as if I was to debate with them, well, what do you define as substance abuse problems? Because what if someone drinks every Friday night with their wife? If they have a couple glasses of wine or every other night, is that a substance abuse problem? What if they drink caffeine every day? Is that a substance abuse? What if they smoke cigarettes every day? What if they smoke marijuana in the evening with their spouse while they watch Ren and Stimpy? Like what's the definition? Because I don't know what that exactly, because if there's this idea of just like, well, if you're using meth or cocaine or heroin, those are bad drugs. But, alcohol and caffeine and nicotine and maybe marijuana these days, these are good drugs. These are okay. And this notion, it's just like this really Nixonian ridiculousness. And so so that's one thing I would say. But anyway, there's a lot of dogma around that in therapy of just like, and I remember a huge amount of arguments going on around me around this when I was early in my career. You have other therapists, and this is me, which is case-by-case basis, where if someone comes to me and says that they want my help with, say, Patron Matt, you're saying that you want, my life is pretty empty, and I think getting a job and finding more friends would greatly encourage sobriety. And so if you said that to me, Patron Matt, you're just like, my life is empty, and I feel like I want to get a job, I want to find more friends. And yeah, I smoke pot every night, or I use meth on the weekends, or I drink 4 beers at night before I fall asleep. Then I would say, well, so there's a possibility that your substance abuse is affecting things and might become a barrier, but I'm not going to kick you out of therapy. We can just talk about that as time goes on, but I'll just throw stuff out to you, Matt, as a therapist. It's up to you to decide whether or not it's getting in your way. Because how would I know, really, if the substance use is getting in the way? The client is the only one that's really going to be able to know that, especially in the sort of the way that I laid it out in that way. Now, if I had a client come in that, and I have had this before in my early career, who was in the midst of a very intense meth addiction or a cocaine addiction, and was high all the time and hallucinating and psychotic at times and obsessed with getting their next fix, then yeah, we're not going to accomplish anything in therapy. But the notion that smoking a bowl at night and watching cartoons or having a couple glasses of wine at night somehow makes you completely like a zombie person that can't do therapy is silly. The other thing is that a lot of research shows that when people are trying to, the reason why they use substances in the first place is because of relational traumas, emotional reasons. And so therapy is the perfect place to help with that. And if we can help them with that, like with Matt, he's saying, I feel pretty empty. If Matt can work on his issues of not being empty, then maybe he won't need to use as much anymore. Or maybe his use is recreational and he is allowed to make his own choices about whether or not it is ultimately good or bad for him. Now, I'm not saying that the therapist, Matt's therapist, is doing a wrong thing. I'm just saying that there are different approaches. I'm just saying I have an approach, and when I teach my supervisees, I teach them all the approaches, and I allow them to make a decision as to what kind of stance they want to have. And there's a lot of things like that in therapy. Like a similar issue is domestic violence in a relationship, in a couple. So a couple comes to us, and we start to detect there's domestic violence. Well, some therapists will say, I can't treat you as a couple. That's just not going to happen. As long as there's violence or control or abuse happening, then we're not going to do therapy. But for me, I understand that completely, but I, and other people in my camp, will take a more nuanced point of view of if it's severe abuse, then perhaps. But if it's below a certain threshold and the abuser is at least agreeing to talk with me about their behavior and we're seeing some change, then what a better place. What a great place to talk about the abuse, in that I am there to hear from the victim's mouth themselves what's happening and speak then directly to the person doing the abusing. And often the abuser is being triggered by something that the victim is doing, not that it justifies the abuse, but it provides a causal link that we can begin to work on. And healing attachment wounds is usually a big part of the thing, and couples therapy can be a great venue for that. So in summary,
yeah,
it's okay for a therapist to say, I don't want to work with you if you're using. It's not unethical. It's not a bad way to treat people. If if that's what a therapist wants to do, then there's totally justification for that. There's a lot of other people that will support that, and that's an approach. In the same way that if I go to a cognitive therapist and I ask them to do psychodynamic therapy, and they're going to say, I'm not going to do psychodynamic therapy, I'm going to do cognitive therapy, I can't be upset because that's their approach, and they're being explicit about their approach to that problem. And that's what's, that's just their approach. Having said that, again, in summary, for me, I take a more nuanced approach. Now, my approach has pros and cons. The pro is that I'm going to be more flexible and perhaps catch situations that therapy would be okay in that situation. The con is I might occasionally enable people to use, quote unquote, enable, by not being more upfront and more confrontational about their use. And I accept those pros and those cons. And if I get into a sticky situation, which I haven't in a long time, then I consult and make sure that I'm not going too far in one direction. Any thoughts on the 25 minutes of talk I just did, Bob?
That was comprehensive. No, I like it. I have a similar attitude towards substance use, and I'm thinking of our old addictions teacher, Lisa Erickson, who I just loved. She was great. Who would say to us, "Not all use is abuse, and not all abuse is addiction." I think she had perhaps a similar kind of flexible attitude about treating folks who have substance use. I wonder though if part of the agreed upon treatment plan is for Matt to be abstinent, or if Matt and therapists can talk about how use impacts his goals. Because one of the things that seems like I'm getting the flavor of in this email is the feeling of judgment from the therapist. I'm not saying the therapist is judging, but it sounds like Matt feels judged. That's never great. So if the therapist really believes, though, use will interfere with goals, then you guys get to talk about that, and you get to decide what you want to do with that, because you may have a mismatch.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's something that could be frustrating for clients, to finally find a therapist that they like and then to run into this issue.
Right. Yeah, that is frustrating.
Yeah.
I would hate for somebody to leave therapy thinking, though, that they either failed or were a failure in the eyes of the therapist.
Right, which brings me to maybe the last point, and hopefully this doesn't go on for another 25 minutes, is that for some clients, and I remember adopting this perspective a long time ago, they might need some time in therapy with a client or with a therapist to kind of gear up for abstinence treatment.
Right.
They're frazzled. They're abused. Their life is going down the tubes. They're afraid. I mean, the thing that is usually present in addiction and compulsive anything is shame and suffering. And so the person that is suffering from the addiction, as they contemplate sobriety, it can be extremely scary to them, right? It's just like perhaps their whole life since they've been 13 years old have been, their suffering has been managed by substance use. And their social life centers around substance abuse or something. And so maybe 10 weeks or 20 weeks of therapy of an exploratory relationship where the client can just think about things without being judged and without someone turning them into the police or something. Mm. And they can just explore that and then eventually maybe come to the conclusion of just like, you know what, I think I really do need to be sober. I need to start looking at this more closely. Mm-hmm. And that can be a great thing too. And for therapists out there listening, it's up to you to decide what you want to do as a policy and or by case basis. But I encourage everyone to I don't know, think carefully about it, because Because people who are suffering, I find that this notion of like, well, you got to get sober before you can be in therapy. I find that centers, to me, it has a, and not always, of course, but it has a ring of, you're a bad person and you're doing a bad thing, and you need to stop doing that bad thing before you can get the good thing. Yeah. You can't have your cake before you eat your peas. You can't have your pudding. What's the?
If you don't eat your meat, you can't have any pudding.
Right. How
can you have any pudding if you don't
have
eat your meat?
It's that. It has that kind of moralizing in it. Like you are making bad choices, and until you start making good choices, you can't eat your pudding. So start making good choices, and then we'll talk. And I don't know if that's the best attitude. Yeah. Again, if you have that policy, there is some absolute soundness to it, but it has pros and cons, and we just have to think about that. All right. Linux says, I've been seeing a new therapist for a year now, and for some time now, he's been forgetting to time limit our sessions. They have been 20 to 30 minutes longer than usual. My old therapist was the same way with me, drawing out our sessions for like 20 to 30 minutes past the designated time. Am I so intriguing that they keep doing this? What's up with this? Why do therapists prolong time limits? End of email. Bob, what do you think?
Well, fellow traveler, because I have that vulnerability myself, particularly if I don't have anybody scheduled after. What do I think? I think that I do that because I feel guilty, or because I feel
as a therapist.
Yeah. Or I feel inspired, or I feel like this is a moment that I want to work with. I think sometimes that means that I'm not managing things properly. I'm not managing myself and my own countertransference properly. So I've worked to get better at that, and generally do not extend sessions. And if I do, I ask the client, you got an extra 5 minutes here. Do you want to, so we can kind of finish this part off. I generally ask clients if they want to do that, because, just because they're there doesn't mean that they want sessions to go on and on. I think I used to have that attitude where I would just presume that if I was willing, then they oh, well, lucky client, because they get someone who's willing to go an extra whatever. And that I think my wife pointed out that was a bit of a presumption on my part, and that my clients might not feel similarly. They might actually want me to hold the time limit. So my point is that these days when I go over, I'm explicit about it. So the other day I was having a session with somebody, and she was in the middle of the most god-awful pain, and I said, it feels bad to end here. Do you mind if shall we just keep talking here? Because, I don't want to, I just thinking of the way you would talk to a friend. It's like they're in the middle of their pain. You don't just say, okay, well, you know what? I got a thing. I'll see you. It's just bad manners.
Yeah. What if the same scenario happens another time and you have a client right after?
Well, I can't. I have a vulnerability to going long and then starting sessions a couple minutes late, which I don't love. And when I do that, I will often ask the client, can we have our full time, and can we go till 5 minutes after or 10 minutes after, or whatever the overage was. And some people say yeah, they can do that, and other people say no, they can't, or they don't want to, because and then I feel bad because it's like, you're paying for this, and I feel like I'm shortchanging you, and that's not okay. It gives us something to talk about that could be really useful. Not that I do that because I want to create fodder for therapy, but I do have my own personal vulnerabilities, and they will impact my clients, and working with those is therapeutic, because it gives an opportunity for us to talk about our relationship and our experience of relationship and what's happening. And unfortunately, I am a person who has this particular vulnerability, not like I used to. By the way, I had a therapist who would do the same thing. She'd go 20 to 30 minutes over, And when that happened, I noticed that I started doing that more easily or frequently. I think simply because it was modeled to me. But I don't have that now, and I try to hold to it because I do believe that holding to the time is providing a sense of containership for clients. And so that's, I believe, a good thing, a helpful thing. So I would encourage this person to talk with their therapist about it because it's, at the very least, a distraction from whatever the good work is or the goals that they have that they want to get to together. And also because just talking about it is... Have you noticed this, Kirk? Have you noticed that despite the fact that you do what you do, that if you're in therapy, it is actually quite challenging to talk to your therapist about therapy?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fucking hard.
Yeah, well, it's vulnerable. And
it's vulnerable.
Yeah, and
right.
You're worried that your therapist is going to be hurt or
right.
scared or uncomfortable.
Yeah, or pissed off or, rejecting or whatever.
Yeah.
At least those are the things that I get worried about. That in itself is therapeutic, though, being able to talk about this. This is kind of piggybacking on what we were saying earlier about the other person that wrote in, is being able to be reflective about the relationship between me and my therapist is actually part of why I'm there.
Yeah.
So I suspect, though, that we get judgmental when we get uncomfortable. And the way I think about this lately is, when you're in an airplane, they say when the oxygen masks drop, put your own on first.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've learned in life that is not so helpful, and by not so helpful, I mean actually not helpful at all, is that I'm responsible for other people's oxygen mask. And so when the oxygen masks drop, it's my job to pay attention to somebody else's need for oxygen and to find their mask and put it on their face while I get hypoxic. And the idea that I might actually just seek my own oxygen mask and let the other person do their thing or not feels scary, feels selfish. And so in that instance, one of the things that I have done, which I wonder if maybe is happening to this person writing in, is I've gotten judgmental of the other because they haven't taken care of me. That isn't, I believe, anybody else's job. If in this case, if I'm in there and I want my session to end at 10 a.m. and not go till 10:20 or 10:30, it's okay for me to speak up and say so. I want to go now. I want our sessions to end on time. It's a hard thing to do. It is vulnerable, just like you say, but it's absolutely reasonable. And this is me grabbing my own oxygen mask and putting it on. And that is a very good thing to do in relationships. So I hope they'll just bring it up.
Yeah, but I could see a scenario where she wants them to go long sometimes and really likes that she gets extra time for free.
Talk about that.
And likes flexibility about the fact that it's, when needed, it goes longer. But the question that she's asking is, what is it about me? Because it is I think a viable question, because she says, my old therapist was saying with me, so she said 2 therapists that have gone long with her.
Oh.
And now, who knows, maybe both of those therapists go along with many clients.
Could be.
But it is possible. I could see a scenario, of course, we have no way of knowing, that there is something about her that provokes something in the therapist to go along. And because well, Bob, answer me this. I don't know if you want to answer this,
sure. But I'll try.
Is it possible that if you think about the clients that you've gone long with in your career over the past 10 years, and the clients that you never went long with, I'm guessing there's a difference between their personality, your relationship, the issues, the vibe they give off, the countertransference you have. What would that be?
Guilt.
You feel guilt.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I have had clients where I've noticed this thing where there's a vulnerability or a tendency for me to not watch the clock the way I normally would. So yeah, it's a managing of my own countertransference, and it's actually a interesting thing to kind of puzzle on and reflect on, because it probably does mean that there's something happening in our relationship or something happening with my client that's leading us to lengthening sessions.
Yeah.
I
And
saw
could
somebody
see
a
it.
long time ago who actually was annoyed with me. This is years ago. Was annoyed with me, but nonetheless, the sessions tended to run long. So it's like they were spending time with somebody who they found annoying, but they're spending more time at the same time as feeling, irritated and having a feeling that I wasn't helpful, and yet our sessions were running long, which to me, they on the surface of it seems a bit contradictory.
Because you felt guilty for not being helpful enough.
I did feel guilty for that.
Yeah.
And so the point of that isn't to run sessions long. The point is to manage my own countertransference and start inquiring what might be happening here for my person, what might be going on.
Yeah.
And I apologize to this person if I misinterpreted the way I responded to the email. Maybe I got a different spin on it than what they're asking, because they're asking this question: is there something about me?
Well,
maybe.
I consider these emails to be a jumping off point to talk about things that are related and unrelated. Mm-hmm. And plus, we don't really know because it's a short email. Mm-hmm. And the person isn't in the room saying like, well, here's the nuance. So I think it's just a stimulus question, if you will. But
Gotcha. Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting that, so I'll tell you, I haven't gone long in a session in years. Mm-hmm. In fact, I can't remember the last time. In fact, I don't know if it's ever really happened. I mean, there was a time when I did in-home family therapy, and those sessions were pretty loosely defined to begin with. So maybe then, but in-office stuff, maybe early career, like 20 years ago, I did. But pretty early in my career, I said to myself that if I let myself do this, if I allow, getting back to our kind of addiction talk, mm-hmm. if I allow myself to occasionally go long with a client when I can, then I'm never going to know when it's okay to do that and when it's not. And I'm always going to feel bad if I don't.
Brilliant.
Because every day there's a last client. Every day you have a client that you could go long with.
Right.
And so I'm going to feel like, well, why did I go long there and not there?
Yeah.
And I'm always going to be wondering, well, should I do it this time? And I'm going to have to think about it in the moment rather than just saying, look, dude, you're going to, and I think this is the conversation I have. I seem to remember thinking this early in my career. I said, I'm going to be a therapist for a long time. I'm going to have thousands of sessions. I don't want to think about this question. And I hear from ethics experts that I'm not supposed to go long. So let's just draw the line. And it's hard, because some clients, they hit their peak 1 minute before the session ends. And it's rough to just be like, sorry, time's up. And there are jokes about this in movies where it's clear that therapists don't really care and they're just in it for the money because they're like, okay, time's up. It's a trope that a client really gets into their material and then the therapist just looks at their watch, time's up, and it's this notion that we don't really care. And so I get that. Now, the other thing that I'll point out is that it is a skill to learn how to pace a session and how to keep an eye on the clock and say, okay, we've got 7 minutes left. I should, as a therapist, direct people towards things that will lend itself to wrapping up the session on time. Especially for me, because I actually don't allow my clients to look at a clock. I don't not allow them, but I don't put the clock in a convenient place for them to look at it because I want them to just kind of luxuriate in the space and not have to like worry about the time. I find that clients who look at the time are more kind of list makers, which is fine to do. I'm a list maker. But I'm the sort of therapist, and the sort of therapy I typically provide is more free associative. And so now sometimes clients will just turn around and look at the clock that's behind their head, or they'll just look at their phone or something. But I find that as a client myself, when I if I saw a clock very closely within my peripheral of my therapist, it just kind of screwed things up for me in terms of my flow. But anyway, so that's interesting that that you bring up guilt. So are you saying that the transference, countertransference is working out to induce guilt in you?
I am.
Yeah. And so, Linux, I wonder, of course, there's no way for us to know, and this would be a great question to ask your therapist, as Bob always says, is it that I'm intriguing? Is it that I induce guilt through transference, countertransference? Is it, what's going on there? And that'd be a, really great question to ask if you want to. Linux, you don't have to. You could just sort of luxuriate in, discounted therapy and free time. There's nothing strange about it. So I have a few things to say about this. One is that there are different types of therapists when it comes to this. Some therapists have loose boundaries, what I'll call loose boundaries, and some therapists have more buttoned up boundaries. I'm more buttoned up. I'd say Bob is more kind of in the middle, and I think Bob is kind of typical. Most people I talk to will say, yeah, with some clients I'll go over. And for me, like I said, I just decided early on that it was just one of those questions I just didn't want to mull over. And I think also I thought to myself, because I remember hearing the scenario, and I guess as a professor and as a supervisor, I just felt like I should practice what I preach. And it's very common for novice therapists to go over, one, because they can't manage their guilt countertransference as well as they can when they're earlier on or later on in their career. But they also inherently feel like they're imposters, because they're just starting out in their career, and they feel like they have to do extra things to get validation that they're doing a good job. And so they are much more likely to give in on things and so I'll hear a lot of novice therapists will go over. And I would frequently tell them, one, do you want to go over? I would always ask. And almost every therapist would say, no, I don't want to go over. Okay. So why are you doing it? What's the countertransference? But really, the kicker is if you're changing the treatment plan, the treatment plan specifically should say 50-minute sessions or whatever, once a week or whatever the period, the regularity is. You're changing the treatment plan. You're essentially saying it's akin to, it's not the same, but it's akin to you give your patient as a physician a medication, and then you're just giving them more medication. So you can change the treatment plan. You can do that. But you have to be explicit about it. And you, Bob, do a little bit of that on the fly. You're just like, so I can go over by 5 or 10 minutes. Would you like to do that? So you're essentially engaging in a conversation about the treatment. And so if you're going to change that, but the bigger issue here that I'm trying to get to is that if you go over with any of your clients, it creates a inherent problem in the future, which is, what about those times that you can't go over with that particular client? And or what about the times when other clients find out you're going over with another client and you never go over with the other client, even though it calls for it, and even though the client might have even asked you? Can we go over today? Is this I'll have clients ask me this question. Am I your last client? Because I feel like I'm not done yet. And so there's this notion out there that people have of just like, well, therapists have this option. And if you give this as an option, what about the times that you don't do it?
Yeah.
What are you going to say? I just don't, you are my last client. And I know you're in the middle of some, very heavy emotional stuff in the last couple minutes, but I just don't want to do it. Like, what are you going to say? It's unethical for me to do it. I am tired and I don't want to work anymore. Like, what are you going to say? There's no good answer. There's nothing you can say in that moment that is going to be very soothing. Now, for many clients, this isn't going to be a problem, but we all know we have clients with abandonment issues that will want more time with us. And if you play fast and loose with that boundary, what happens when you pull back on the boundary? Now, if you want to change the treatment plan, which I've done, to hour and a half every time you meet, and you always make sure it's your last appointment because you believe treatment-wise this is a good idea, then just set that as the treatment plan. Just say, this is now the treatment plan. And if any other client asks, like, well, how come I'm not getting it? It's like, well, your treatment plan is actually an hour because that's what it calls for. This other client, is an hour and a half because that's the treatment plan we set forward. So there's nothing wrong with going over, but you have to make it a part of the treatment plan because you run into these risks of people being hurt. And almost always with the novice therapists that I work with, they hit a point where they're like, okay, Kirk, I'm done going over because I don't want to go over anymore. It always feels bad to me. I feel like I'm not doing a good job. I feel like I'm just giving away free service. I'd rather be going to the bathroom and taking a break or, getting paperwork done. And I don't want to do this anymore. And that's where it's like an addiction. It's like you started something and it's hard to pull back. Once you do it, it's hard to say, I don't want to do this anymore. It's so much easier to just say, I'm never going to do this under any circumstances, unless the client is saying, I'm going to kill myself and there's some kind of safety issue. Even if they're in the middle of something intense, and like I said, there are ways to sort of wrap up a session. Literally just saying things like, and I'm sure you've said stuff like this, Bob. Oh my God, I didn't look at the clock. It's the end of our session, and you're in the middle of something extremely intense, and I feel so bad ending a session where we have to end it. It's my fault that I didn't notice the clock 5 minutes ago and kind of steer the conversation towards wrapping up the session. I feel so awful, but we have to end the session right now. There's nothing wrong with saying that. And there's nothing wrong with a client hating you and talking about it in your next session, as you always say, Bob. Yeah. And in my notes here, I said, that it's often about countertransference, but you already said this, Bob, and about guilt. But just to expand on that, in my experience, is guilt, wanting to be helpful, not wanting to reject a client, wanting a friend in a client. I've seen that before too. Like you don't have enough friends, or you have some sort of countertransference about wanting to be social with that person. And so in your soul, in your heart, you kind of feel like the session is more of a hangout than an actual professional service. Or a lover. And I've heard this before too. And I'm not saying, Bob, you're doing this, but I've heard progressions where the end of the progression is they had sex, the client, the therapist had sex. And at the beginning of the progression is clients going over. It's the slippery slope, Of course, that's a rare instance, but it is something I've seen. Therapists wanting approval, lack of personal life, lack of ethics training, bad boundaries in general. Like when I hear this going over, it's often accompanied by being late at the beginning of a session, not showing up for a session, talking about your other clients with your clients, talking about your own self-disclosing too much, in an unhelpful way. And so sometimes it's like tip of the iceberg. Have I sufficiently shamed you, Bob?
I'm doing okay.
I mean, it's not my intention to shame you at all. I thought it was good that it's like, okay, let's normalize this behavior because it's not like it's that uncommon for a therapist to go over. But I don't know, like, what do you think in terms of the idea that what happens in that moment when you don't want to go over?
Yeah, no. Listen, I'm listening to everything you're saying, and despite the shame that's coming up and the anxiety that's coming up, I still like hearing what you're saying, and I like the idea that not only am I contributing to this podcast, but I'm also getting to learn. So for me, it's a revisiting of something that's been going on in some form or other, more or less these days, for the entirety of my work life. So thinking about this is good for me, and it doesn't have to be pain-free in order to be okay.
Yeah. Now, the final thing I'll say is we all know, and particularly you and me, Bob, that the therapeutic healing action is the relationship.
Yeah.
is feeling as though, as a client, your therapist genuinely likes you, cares about you, that you're not just another case, that you're not a number, that you're a human being. And so going over could facilitate that a little bit. Like, another sort of example along these lines was, I had a client, a family, where there was a sudden death in the family, and a child. And this was in the midst of me treating the family. And they called me for an emergency session. Well, that's kind of, I generally don't allow for emergency sessions for a variety of reasons. But I, allowed that boundary crossing in that instance because it was important. The session went way over. It went for 3 hours. It was way over 1 hour. And why did I do that? Well, because I thought the situation called for it. So there are situations, lesser situations, where, say, a client is, really struggling with something, and your heart is really involved in the room as a therapist. You're really caring for the client and feel connected and feel like their healing is doing a lot in this moment, and you really want to emphasize how much you care. And you're at the end of the day, and you could go over for 20 minutes, and you do that as a space to continue talking, but also as a gesture of just how much you care. Going to someone's graduation or going to someone's wedding, you don't have to do that, and it is a bit of a risk. And ethics experts will say, there's a downside to that, and you got to be careful. But if we're going to be human beings, sometimes it means thinking about opportunities to emphasize how much we care, and that the client isn't just a client. The client is a human being, and we're both human beings. And if going over facilitates that, then that can be powerful. It just has to be balanced with all the things we've been saying thus far.
Yeah, right. Wouldn't want to do that just impulsively.
Yeah. Let's wrap it up there. What do you say, Bob?
I say let's wrap it up there.
So what's the final word? What do you want to tell the listeners this week?
Geez, I don't know. I'm not good at the final word. You go first.
A lot of you out there are in therapy. A lot of you aren't. And for those of you who are, you deserve a space in therapy to be who you are, and to be vulnerable, and to be real. And so I say that. To you people who aren't in therapy, you deserve to have a therapist that you could be real with. You deserve to have a relationship that you can be real with. For you therapists out there, you deserve to have wonderful, meaningful sessions that feel good, and you're not looking at the clock because you're bored. And often that involves leaning into the relationship, processing your own countertransference, and really enjoying this work. I mean, it's when you're in the flow of a session, it's a wonderful experience to feel connected, to feel like you're really giving someone the sustenance that they need. And it's a two-way street. It just feels we tend to think in this linear fashion, like, well, and people will often ask us these questions. It's like, well, how do you deal with all the emotional outlay of being a therapist? And one way to look at it is that when two people bond and are real, they're both filled by some other substance in the universe. That it's not a transfer of energy from one person to another. It's two people creating something that they, suck the marrow out of the universe, and they both get something out of it. And I do. When I was just telling my supervisees this yesterday, that when therapy when I feel like I'm doing a good job as a therapist and I'm in the flow. Well, no, this is what I said. What I said was, throughout my life, I've had a number of different jobs. And the thing that I really noticed about myself and different jobs was how, if I wanted to go out after my shift, if I had energy enough to go to a movie or to meet up with my friends. And there were jobs like when I was a shoe salesman at the Foot Locker at Westlake Mall, downtown Seattle, that after a 10-hour shift, I was on my feet all day, and it was such an emotionally sort of bummer of a job that I could not do anything after my shift. I just went home and vegged out on the couch and then went to sleep. But then fast forward, 3 or 4 years, and I'm a therapist for 10 hours a day. And when I was in the flow of it after my shift, I'd be ready to go out with you sometimes. Why is that? Both can have their energy outlay, but to be a therapist means when you're in the flow and you've built those kinds of relationships with clients, it's invigorating, man. Mm-hmm. It's life-giving. It's inspirational. It's moving. It's invigorating. After a good session, I want to jump around. I'm not drained. Now, mm-hmm. I can absolutely be drained. Mm-hmm. Not to say that that's a negative thing, but I can absolutely be drained after a session for sure. So it's not like a dichotomy there or some kind of spectrum. But I will say to you therapists, some of you already know this very well, but if you don't, you deserve to have the kind of therapy profession experience that I and Bob have, which is a glorious, meaningful, healing experience that you kind of heal in the moment too. That's my final word. What's yours, Bob?
That's a great final word. I think maybe the main or one of the main functions of your podcast is to reduce suffering. And I really appreciate when people write in with these painful, important questions, because it seems to me that they write in with an aim at reducing suffering in the universe. And, we have this lovely opportunity to sort of kick it around and think out loud and be heard. And hopefully we're adding something to the universe that does reduce suffering. So I guess my final word is my hat's off to people that write in with these important and personal questions, because I believe it has that effect.
Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.